Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. And I have been given this job of informing you that we are going to try and cut this short. It was supposed to be a 60-minute session, but we are going to do it in 45 minutes. So I have the task of cutting you short if you have very long, winding comments or questions. So please bear with me for that. I have the privilege of introducing to you Rohini, who does not want to be introduced because she says she's been introduced earlier. So I will introduce Renana Ben. Renana Ben, who we all know, is a Padma Shri awardee, known best for her work with SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association. She is now the president of SEWA Bharat, which is a federation of SEWA organizations across the country. She's written extensively about women and work. She's also been Chancellor of the Gandhigram Rural University earlier. She was member of the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. Thank you for being here, and moving straight into it, we're going to ask Rohini and Renana Ben to present 10 minutes each. We hope to hear about the intersections of policy and research and how those gaps could be bridged. And after they do 10 minutes, we'll probably chat for another 10 minutes each, and then we'll chat for another 10 minutes, and then open it up to questions, to very brief questions. Thank you. Over to Rohini.
Thank you very much. So we will be swift. Actually, at the start of the day, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to talk about, but a lot of the discussions during the day were fascinating. But I was also, I guess, fascinated by the fact that we talked a lot about the care economy, but we didn't actually talk about the starting point of it, which is marriage. And so I wanted to talk about some facts that actually one of the graduate students here who worked with us for a year before going to graduate school helped put together, which is really, I think, just some really basic descriptive facts on how a labor force participation in India looks different often than other countries. And I think these facts are largely untainted by measurement issues. I think a lot of important measurement issues are brought up. But I think these life cycle issues, and I think the issues they raise, are really just striking and I think hold up no matter what fact you use. So let me start with the precursor that when we think about women's work, sort of, and I'm very much going to take cue from Manish here, that I think we should look at what we see in India, not sort of try to fit onto India facts we see in other parts of the world. But I think one fact that has been written about endlessly for women's work, and I think people have used that therefore as somewhat of a framework, even though I think Ashwini pushed back against it, I know Rosa has worked against it, is this idea of the role of childbirth in female labor force participation. So if you look at most rich countries, the pattern of female labor participation is described as M-shaped. Women get educated, they enter the labor market, and start at roughly the same levels as men today in most advanced economies. They drop out or reduce hours of work when they have children, and then depending on the country, they re-enter at different rates. So in Scandinavia, the second part of the M looks very similar to the first. In Japan, it's much flatter. And so I think as a result, there's been, I think even today morning, a lot of the discussion was very interchangeably thinking about the care economy, I think largely with reference to what happens after marriage and labor force participation. But I think the striking fact you see in India is a lot of this decision is made before marriage. So what we see in the data is actually I'm taking a point, Ashwini's point, there's a lot of volatility. Women don't drop out at childbirth particularly. If you want, the selection that's happening is at the point of when women are marrying. So the first fact, and this holds true whichever data set you use more recently, is you find the steady increase in women entering the labor force still around the age of 35. So remember, they're having kids around 25, 26. They're not dropping out on aggregate then. And then it stabilizes, and then it starts declining at retirement. So I think the question we need to ask, and I believe that marriage is a large part of answering that question in India, is why are women not entering the labor market, not why they're dropping out. Those are extremely important questions. I completely take on point, Ashwini, that for groups of people, you're going to see a lot of volatility. But I think on average, what you see, just cross-sectionally, is this life cycle effect. And the part that actually, if you you look at it to ask what's happening, again, by age, because I think it's important to ask what's happening as age. This is not the best graph, but I think I can explain the first parts of it. By each age range, what are people doing, and it's separately for men and women, between whether you're unmarried and studying, that's the purple, so the start, that's a very high number. And then the other one you should look at is the purple, which is unmarried and not working, and unmarried and working. So notice for men, as the deep purple declines, as they move out of studying, they're moving into work. For women, there's very little of that unmarried working. So they're typically going from unmarried studying to married studying or married not working. And I actually think this is very consistent often with what you hear as the government logos of Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, but it sort of ends there. And certainly, I think for all of us who spend time in the field, it's very common now in rural areas. I think what Ashwini says is exactly right. Educated girls don't want to end up in agriculture. I think parents are very comfortable daughters studying until the age of 18. But essentially, after the age of 18, partly because of maybe security concerns or others, they don't want their daughters to go out. So the daughters are sort of hanging around for a year or two. And then after that, they're getting married. And because in India, at the time of marriage, typically, in rural India at least, you migrate out of your village, you're then, it's also less clear how you go about getting a job. You move to another village where you actually don't know anyone, really. You probably don't even know your husband very well. And you're going to typically have your fertility has declined, but it's typically the case that you still have your first child within 1 or 2 years of marriage. There is not a lot of timing. So you're in a new village or a new area with a husband you don't know very well and with a young child. And that's sort of the reality at which you have to figure out what you're going to do. So I think a lot of what one must think about is what's happening with women. I think we've talked about this. Education is a very limited predictor of work. It's certainly probably it's a strong predictor of not wanting to work in agriculture. But unlike, this is again very different from other countries. And so education is incredibly important. Let's not take away from that. I think we all would agree with Professor Sen. Education is a form of freedom. But this big hope that female education would have been enough didn't happen to be the case. I think the last slide talked a bit about this. Service sectors are important, and I think we should think about what's happening there. But contractual status is very poor. This is all from PLFS data. So in each of these, what you see, most women do not have a written contract. They don't have often longer-term contracts, and we saw that, for instance, in terms of the big migration out at the time of when the lockdown happened. So I think that's the reality in which we have these jobs. The last couple of slides that I'll just talk, and then I'm going to just stop and hand over to Renana Ben, is we've talked a lot about norms around work and marriage. I wanted to just kind of give you one piece of descriptive evidence, and this is from like 5 or 6 years ago, which is we did a survey under the DDU-GKY scheme of former trainees from who were entering these skill training programs. I don't think there's much surprise. I think both men and women don't stick in these jobs very much. Actually, the pipeline is very leaky even for men who get skills training under this program. This is an interesting program because for the trainers to get paid, you don't just have to train the boys and girls, you actually have to place them in a job. And you get your final payments as the trainer, they're private sector trainers, if someone stays in a job for 3 months. So there's actually a lot of incentives for the trainers to get it right. But what you see is when you look at the reasons for leaving, it's kind of, I felt like you could have guessed this. Why do men leave? They say wages are too low, the food isn't good. Why do women leave? Because they're being pulled back for family reasons. And when you talk to employers, they very often say that if the women come and stay, they stay for a long amount of time, they're good workers. The men who come, they always say, men kind of just complain a lot, they leave very fast under this program. And I think that's just kind of the reality of what we are seeing in this. And women are getting pulled back, not for childbirth, not for, very broadly, but they're getting pulled back for marriage. So I think I just wanted to kind of bring in the fact that I think we can talk about reproduction and care and all things are extremely important. But I think one of the elephants in the room that we also have to talk about is the agency that women have around marriage. And with that, I'll hand it to Renana Ben.
Can you hear me? Because it's, okay. Well, what I really wanted to talk about was not data, but why things are as they are, or what's the key issues, and what can be done, or what have we been seeing. As you know, I've been working in SEWA for decades, many decades, and seen many things happen, so I would just rely on my experience. But I cannot resist talking something about the labor force participation, and that is way back in the 70s. I think Devki Jain did the first study, micro study, showing that the NSS data was wrong, that it was far, far lower than what the reality was. And as Maua said, you know, in Bihar, 8% of women are working. Does that sound right? Why does that happen? I won't go into it right now, but I do feel that we need to keep re-emphasizing this, because every study that researchers do go back to the NSS and give it more and more credibility. You know, many women economists have been saying this, but it's decades. There's been no response. So I still do feel we need to raise this, that, you know, you're using data that's incorrect. Is that the right way to go about things? The second thing I wanted to say was this whole issue of unpaid work. Now, we think about unpaid work as cooking and cleaning and childcare. But in the Indian context, where we have over 50% of self-employed and small family enterprises, of course, largest being family farms, the quote unquote unpaid work that is done by women actually is part of that family enterprise. Why should it be called unpaid and the man's be called the real work and the woman's is unpaid work? Because the man then gets the money. When he's a farmer, he'll sell it. If they are producing milk, he'll sell it, though he hasn't done any work for the livestock. So the issue, I think, is we really need to separate unpaid work for reproductive reasons with unpaid work that you're just calling into, that goes into actual quote unquote economic or productive work. So I think those are two points that I'd like to make again and again, and made for many years, but it doesn't have much impact. Okay. Why are things as they are? I want to go into this whole gender. We've been talking about gender norms and culture, and I was really pleased to see in the first session, there was a lot of discussion from all three about that. But what we come across often is why aren't women in the workforce? Why are they not getting jobs? Why are they not moving forward? Because of gender norms. And what do they mean by gender norms is that the family is pulling them back. That's what you also just said. The family is pulling them back. So the whole issue of gender norms is about the supply side. And we do feel that one needs to look at the gender norms or the gender bias, what Ashwini has been raising continuously, at the demand side. And there I'd like to separate. One is women going for wage labor, different types of wage labor. And what do we see? And here I'd like to give some things that we have seen, which is anecdotal, of course, is that there is a very strong gender bias, which is, I would call a gender norm, against employing women. In what way? I'll give you one example. There's an area in Andhra where there was a large section of solar plants coming up, and we were asked to train women and some men in those villages, which are poor villages but educated, and we did a really good training. The women, of course, did better than the men. 70% were women, 30% were men. All 30% men got jobs, all 70% women did not get jobs. And the reason was that it was, well, I'm wrong. 4 women did get jobs. This is, I think we trained about 250. 4 women got jobs because one company, which was a Tata company, decided that they would hire women. The rest were hiring through contractors. And when we talked to the contractors, they said the usual thing: women can't travel, women will go away, women's safety, we can't guarantee their safety, and they are not productive, and so on. You know, the usual things that they say, but they were contractors, they were not employers. And this is something in our country that we hire a lot through contractors. The other example I have is we spent a lot of time training construction workers to become masons and more skilled. And again, we found that the contractors would not hire them. It was, and the opposition was not even so much from the contractors as the male workers. They could not bear to see those women working alongside them. There are many other things we keep coming across. The whole issue of toilets, nobody thinks it's important because, you know, men can do anything anywhere. But I'd like to turn especially to the self-employed sector, because we find in a way that is more responsive. Where's the gender norms or the gender bias first? As I think Gaurav pointed out, and I found that actually does happen, that it seems to be easier, not easy, but easier for women to start an enterprise, to start a small enterprise. And generally they start it in near or in their homes, but the growth is always an issue. And we did look at why are these women, why are they not growing? I think what we found was, again, NSS data, 80% of these small self-employed enterprises of women, 80% are less than 10 lakh turnover per year. So that's actually very small. And why were they not growing? And we identified, of course, there were internal issues too, which were, again, cultural norm issues. But there were the more major issues was the lack of supply lack of supply of vital inputs. Finance. Finance is the big one. Microsave, I think we have here somebody from Microsave, did a study with us, for us, on these small women micro-entrepreneurs and where do they get finance, and they don't. They literally do not get finance. They, right now you have microfinance which provides little loans, but you know, if you're an enterprise you need something bigger and then bigger and then bigger. So that does not exist in our system. In markets, this is an interesting thing we've seen in markets where I'm talking about offline markets where you actually have to go and sell. Say street vendors, urban street vendors, we see more and more women getting pushed out of vending spaces. And part of it is violence, but part of it is, again, the male vendors do not like them there. And they, you know, eventually push them out. And where we have what we call Mahila markets, they do very well. And another example, this is again in Bihar, where some of the farmers were going to sell, they didn't used to go and sell in the marketplaces, but you know, once they became sort of collective, they began going, and they pushed their way into having a little Mahila space, but they didn't have it earlier. So I think this is changing cultural norms at the demand side, or cultural biases at the demand side, and also bringing in actual changes, structural changes at the demand side. And there I want to give examples. Firstly, again for wages, some of the things, okay, let me just go into where I feel we have more success. And where I feel we have more success is, again, the micro-entrepreneurs. So when we trained construction workers, and it was difficult for them to work on site. Those who became successful became small contractors, which means that they would take a contract, do it on their own, not have to work with a large contractor or not have to work with a whole lot of males. So turning their skill into a small enterprise was something that was very useful to them. Training drivers, auto rickshaw drivers, again, they turned their skill into a small enterprise. They would buy an auto rickshaw and then do it. So I think we actually feel the finance. We find, we have our own bank, we have a lot of cooperatives which are doing finance. We find that when finance for enterprises is available, a lot of women tend to grow their enterprises. It's not that large, it's about 20% is when we did the last, and the others, sort of remain where they are. But even 20% growing is a lot. So finance is extremely important. And then now we're trying to get them into online markets. Again, there's a big gender bias in online markets. 2 minutes, okay. But I think, you don't stop looking at the families and the community. And we really have to work there. I think Mahua said they started Jivika with social development. And you have to do that. Because the change, I think, the change in the family and the community comes not necessarily from you and me raising awareness. It comes from the women themselves, and they have the strength to do it when they come together. So creating groups, awareness in the groups, and then the groups pushing their way or changing the family norm. And we find it especially useful for youth groups because the young girls are so much used to doing what the elders tell them. But then youth groups does help them to change. So I think that whole collectivization is extremely important. And finally, I just wanted to say there was this question, research and policy and practice. I'm actually not talking about research and policy. I'm talking about practice and what we are seeing from practice. But it's very important for us, even in our practice, when we need, say, I keep going back to this finance issue because it's something that we need to work on, or which we are already working on. And if we had good research, or if not even good research, if we had research which supported our point of view. So that's why Ashwini's research I find very useful because it's the whole issue about the demand side rather than the supply side. Okay, I'll end here and maybe I'll say a few more remarks later.
Thank you so much, Renana Ben. Rohini, would you like to respond to something that Renana Ben brought up about collectives and collectivization and unions and women's movements and the role that they can play in informing political and economic capital that women have? Is that something that India is lacking at a pan-India level?
I think I'm not the right person to answer the question about kind of the state of, say, unions for women. The one thing I would talk about, and I talk about it with reference to a book that actually next to mine, it's going to come out in the fall, so I'm very happy to give it also a plug. So it's on the patriarchal political order. So her work is based on kind of very detailed and long-term work with self-help groups in Madhya Pradesh, and looking at it in the context with Pratham, which did a lot of strengthening of it. And I think she would completely agree that basically, I think the puzzle she starts with is, kind of voting is high in India. Men and women both are electorally engaged when it comes to votes. But if you look for any form of non-electoral political participation, it could be going to the Gram Sabha, it could be actually going to other meetings, you actually find that there's a very large gender gap there. And her view is that this is actually a reflection both of just the the patriarchal household where the view would be that women should vote as men do, but then also it gets entrenched further because for a party activist, it's much easier to just have to deal with one person in the house rather than having to separately go and persuade a husband and a wife that they should vote. In a way, it's much easier if you can just, tell the slum leader, and the slum leader can just talk to the men and get that in place. And so the way she found that she sees that there was change in Madhya Pradesh was very much through self-help groups. That this became a space where women came out, they could work and actually make a difference. One place where I've seen something similar and is actually coming to finance, where I would just double down and say that is incredibly important, is actually with microfinance groups. So one of the features of microfinance groups that often gets talked about less is that repayments happens in group meetings. And actually, when I think microfinance started in Bangladesh, I think that was one of the things that actually the Grameen Bank recognized, that this would become an acceptable way for women to actually get out of the house and get together as a group. And what we found in work we did in Calcutta is that when you have microfinance groups that meet more often, there develops more solidarity, they have more friends, more willingness to, kind of engage. So as I said, I can't speak about unions. I'm sure they would be extremely important, and I think SEWA is a great example of an incredibly important pan-India, but I think certainly at what we've seen at the village level and what other people have documented, that's important. Let me just highlight another way that I think you can get collective strength, which I think is actually a place where I think women aren't being supported as much as they can, is actually, we've been talking a lot about digital, but it's through mobile phones, right? So, I mean, what we hear is that people sometimes think, oh, villages are very small. They're not so small. So actually, a woman who has a phone can actually call up even her self-help group leader and say, when is the meeting, what's happening? The problem is that that actually is a place where younger women particularly face a lot of constraints on phone use. There's a lot of concerns of purity and chastity that get tied around having phones, and work Simone and I and others have been doing, and many people from Inclusion Economics India Center have been involved with. What we found very striking is there are separate norms for what people would call supervised and unsupervised use. And so, supervised use is much more acceptable, but unsupervised use is less acceptable. Certainly, if you're married, it's more acceptable, but there's still a big gap. So I think, again, that's a place where I think there's a lot of push right now by the government to get in India and other countries, to get phones in the hands of women. But I think trying to think about how it stays with them, especially if they are smartphones. I mean, what we often see is smartphones will go to the men in the family, women will get the button phones, as they call. And so I think thinking about those things are, in a digital world, that's probably how kind of socialization or going to take place to some extent. So let me stop there.
Renana Ben, I'll ask you to respond to that also, but if I can just slip in a little bit more about technology and mobiles and digital empowerment of women in rural India, we've seen that it can cut both ways, right? For example, in Narega, we found that a lot of women are unable to now access work under Narega because of the requirement of having to have cell phones, smartphones with them that they're able to use in order to mark their attendance, etc. What has been the experience that you have seen in rural India in terms of technology, and also in terms of gendered policy making within the digital sphere?
I think, we just echoing what Rohini said, which is that the actual obtaining and use of a smartphone is extremely limited, or is far lower for women than it is for men. And if there's a smartphone in the house, the man will always take it away. But what we have been finding, and now, as I said, this is a limited experience of the women who are members of SEWA or who we've been reaching out to, which is the moment you get a smartphone, or the woman gets a smartphone in her hand and understands how to use it, they make very creative uses of it. And I can give you two kinds of uses they do of it. One is, of course, they do use it for employment. It's not the most, use they make of it, but they do use it for employment. So women who do home-based work with garments or food, they're forever looking at it to see what new designs are coming out, etc. I've come across a number of women, quite a few, who have been giving tuitions, and apparently you can get lessons online, which you then teach other children. So that's how they've been financing their own education. In that way, it's been very incredibly useful. Another very useful thing is it really helps in collectivization and in reaching out messages. And we saw that most in COVID, because in SEWA we have women who are what we call agivans, sort of leaders. And you know, when you have a large number, and I think this is true of government programs also, you can't reach out to everybody, but you do have the leader, like the leader of the self-help group and so on. So giving one message which then can be spread, and they become incredibly good at using that cell phone for bringing messages, telling people about meetings, telling people, COVID, of course, we saw a lot of that, a lot of messages about vaccinations and what you do when there's COVID and so on. And that has been continuing. So I think it can be a very good way for collectivization. I also think that the more it's used, the more women own these smartphones, and the more it's seen that, you know, they're not all running off with men, other men, the more it will be used. So, you know, again, when things begin to happen, there is cultural change and there is social change. So I think that, but I want to say something else, which is related to what we were talking of before, which is, as I said, there's a lot of gender bias in the wage labor. And now going to the formal sector, which I've been seeing a lot now, and the corporate sector, which I think Pooja from Mahindra talked about, there's a lot of gender bias. And of course, that then translates into the women themselves. Oh, we can't do it. We've been told we can't do it. But basically, it's, you know, you stay out. And in the corporate sector, mostly, I mean, apart from maybe some higher level positions, what I've been seeing happening, which I think is a very interesting trend, is there's a lot of international investments. And the international investment coming in from Europe, and especially from Europe, they all want, what do they call it? Not gender, anyway, they all want that you want to hire, should be hiring more women. Yeah, it's called diversity, sorry. So they want more diversity, and they're pushing for more diversity. And people don't know how to get that more diversity. And the pool doesn't exist. So, you know, it's always better to take from the pool. So I think what's important now is to see that that is happening, and how do we keep creating that pool. So anyway, and that reaches way down, because we have some finance companies we are working with, and field work, branch offices, all those are all very, very, very male. Even microfinance. Microfinance, the customers are women, 10%, and 10%, 9% now, or 8 is it, of employees are females.
Can I just add on that? I was actually talking recently to someone who was, you know, actually from an Indian company, it was interesting telling me this perspective, is there is a tech company, and they were like, you know, we work a lot with the companies on the West Coast, and, you know, they're just telling us they're not going to have us in the room if we go up with our usual senior management, which is all of us, and we're very good, but what shall we do about this? Because they're saying that, you know, we need to see the women in the room. And I think it's a great source of pressure if it works, because I think, you know, as you said, I think that's particularly a level where we're just seeing women often at entry level, but, you know, they're just falling off by the top. And so I think just being almost called out internationally may well be something that works when domestically doesn't.
All right, and with your permission, can I now open it up for questions? We already have several hands going up. We'll take a round of questions, and could you please keep it short and direct? And
Introduce them.
introduce yourself, please. And if you want to direct it to someone, to either of Rohini or Renana Ben, just say so. Yes, can we take the question at the back, gentlemen? Yeah, I think. Yeah, the lady at the back. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Just thought which struck me based on a lot of the conversations about digitization, mobile phone access, remittances, and so on. Something I've observed both personally and through stories and in my work is that this move to a cashless economy has led to an increased sort of taxation on women's earnings by the family. That when women were getting paid more in cash, they were concealing their actual quantum of earnings from other elder or male members of the family. So they were earning 6,000, but they say they're earning 3,000 or 4,000, and the rest of the money they have complete control over. And once it's moved, to like a proper online digitized everything in white, that they actually are losing control over their earnings. So I was wondering your thoughts on this. Is this a more common phenomenon?
Manish, you had a question?
Sure. Renana, one of my biggest projects in the last 20 years after meeting you has been getting you to agree with me. So I should probably quit while I'm ahead. But you've been saying that you're intrigued by the demand side and thinking about the demand side. Employers already generate our own power. We already provide public transport. We manufacture our own employees. And since this morning, I've been listening to people saying we should provide housing, we should give 2 extra days off. Somebody at T told me we should give 1 year off for this. I mean, every organization has fitness for purpose, right? So do you think this is an unrealistic is it even desirable? And maybe it's desirable. Is it viable? I mean, Rohini wants us to lose contracts if there's no women on the video conference. So is this even desirable? And if it's desirable, is it viable?
There's another gentleman at the back. Yes, at the back there. Yes.
Yeah, so I think we heard about that marriage migration creates disruption. And then we have been talking about collectivization. I was wondering that, and we spoke that collectivization seems to have some impact on shifting the power dynamics. So, but we haven't talked a lot about intergenerational collectivization. And so I would just want to see if you have some thoughts on that, because that might be a key for introducing a woman who's migrating out of marriage to introduce to a new institution and just embed in that.
Thank you. We have only about 6 or 7 minutes, so I'll go with Rohini first, and then Renana Ben, and then we can see if we have time for another round.
So, Janavi, I guess the only answer I can give you, I can see that. I think the one thing that we found worked when, at least we were looking in NREGA, is to have women have their own accounts and have direct deposit into it. That's the one way. Then, maybe they will still have to show their bank statement, but trying to move away from joint accounts into individual accounts, and I think especially with all the Aadhaar authentication, that's perhaps easier. Now, it may still be an issue, but I think that perhaps would help. I think Manish should be surprised since you think we never agree, but I actually, on this, tend to agree with you, because I think that what the research tells us, that in general, creating special status harms women. So, for instance, we have no evidence that a maternity leave of more than 6 months does anything for women's career. It actually typically does much worse. So you think of a country like Germany, which actually has very long maternity leave, up to 3 years, much of the evidence that has looked at it has found that it has actually made it worse. What we find positive effects is childcare, right? So I think, and that's not, and I'm completely with you, that's, I think, is the state's responsibility, not actually a company's responsibility. I actually think the maternity leave policy in India is very poorly designed currently, because companies are directly taxed. I think and then you have a lot of incentive to not hire women. What I think you need is this funded centrally by the government, and the government should then raise taxes through companies and so on. But just linking a firm's wage bill directly to whether you hire a man or a woman is just going to give them always incentives to not hire women. So I actually think that we should be moving away from those kind of things, much more to having the state play the role when it comes to childcare, when it comes to financing maternity leave and issues like that. Harsh, on your question, I think I didn't totally understand what you meant by intergenerational. Yeah.
So I think when we talk about collectivization, we see in SHG similar age group of women are collectively working. Yeah. But if younger women are not participating in that, then when they out-migrate, they are again forming a group of their own age group.
I see.
So if there is like some way these both age group can work together, they might be able to like create some large scale impact.
That's a good question. I'm actually going to defer to Renana Ben, who probably knows much more about that.
Okay, so let me start with that. And, this self-help group has been a very, how much finance it got in the hands of women and didn't get is one thing, but it has been a major change of social norms, a major change of social norms. And because the government is doing it and supporting it, and therefore it has a credibility, it's very important. Your intergenerational point is absolutely right, and the next thing they really need to do is the youth groups. Whether that's with money or not with money is a different question, but creating youth groups is something I think that they should be doing as the next big policy change for this whole intergeneration thing. Just one thing that I've observed is that usually in families, it's the mother who is supporting the child, a young woman, to study further or to go and work. And the opposition comes somewhat from the father and a lot from the brothers. So I think, women who have not had the opportunity do want the young daughters to have it. Of course, their power in the house is much less. And Janvi's point about this digitalization and then it becomes open, I actually agree with that. And I give you our own experience, which is, both in our SEWA bank and in cooperatives. Earlier, when we started this policy of sending SMS of how much money has been deposited or how much money has come out, we got a lot of violence happened in the families, because the men suddenly came to know how much money the women had. So often now women, especially when they have their own account, they tell you, please don't send me any SMS. I'll come in and find out what my balance is. So I think it's not so much the digitalization, or maybe it is, but it's getting the information into the family. Women have a certain independence in using the income. And Manish, I don't disagree with you with everything, only a few things. But what you talk about, which comes out of your practice, is, I think, very valuable. I think it's not, it's not really this physical, giving a certain physical benefit. I think it's much more an attitude. And the physical benefits, apart from maternity, the other physical benefits, I don't think anybody's saying that housing for women should be specially made. That's a state function, not a company function. But I think, smaller things like toilets are very important, extremely important. The kind of workplace interactions, when you have an all-male one, you find men screaming and shouting and using a lot of very filthy curse words. And thirdly, what I was talking about, the bias, that women shouldn't be here, women, when they come in, you sort of, what was the word you used, Ashwini, microaggressions. So I think that's the more important point, to bring women into the workforce, rather than the very big issues. And I also don't agree with the night work thing. With banning night work completely. Okay.
I think all of us would like to hear a little more, but we are out of time and we're also hungry. So thank you very much. We're going to have, the conversation is very, very resonant, and we're going to be thinking about it over lunch, probably queuing up around you to ask you some more questions. Thank you so much, and do stay with us for the next half.